Professor Qar'thin adjusted his 7 optical appendages as he gazed out through the quantum glass windows of the Galactic Institute of Higher Learning. The 3 suns of the Centauri system cast a prismatic glow across the crystalline spires of the most prestigious university in known space. He let out a slow whistle through his respiratory tubes, a sound that had become synonymous with deep contemplation among his species. Another cycle, another batch of the galaxy's finest minds, he hummed to himself, watching as students from over 300 different species floated, crawled, and propelled themselves through the anti-gravity corridors. The sight would have been chaos to the untrained eye, but there was an elegant order to it all. Methane-breathing Jovians kept to their pressurized tubes, while the plasma-based life forms from the Carina Nebula maintained their designated safe distances from the water-based species. Professor Qar'thin, a voice chimed from his office communication system. "The faculty meeting is about to begin." Acknowledged, he responded, his voice carrying the weight of his 400 years of academic excellence. The professor's tentacles quickly organized the scattered holopads on his desk, each containing partial solutions to what had become known as the gravity wave paradox. As he made his way to the faculty chamber, students respectfully parted ways. Some even retracted their sensory organs, a sign of ultimate respect in most carbon-based life forms. Professor Qar'thin had earned every bit of that respect, having solved 3 of the galaxy's 10 grand mathematical mysteries. But the gravity wave paradox? That one had haunted him for the past 2 centuries. The faculty chamber was already buzzing with activity when he arrived. Dean Voxtel, their crystalline administrator, was projecting agitated color patterns, something that only happened during particularly controversial discussions. Professor Melrin, with her quantum probability field flickering erratically, was already engaged in what appeared to be a heated debate. "We simply cannot accept a Deathworlder into our institution." Melrin's probability field pulsed an angry red. "Their planet has gravity that would crush most of our faculty. Their bodies contain enough acid to dissolve 3 floors of our facilities." Dean Voxtel's crystalline structure refracted light in what Qar'thin recognized as a pattern of patience. The human applicant has passed every entrance exam with unprecedented scores. Their understanding of mathematical principles, while primitive, shows remarkable potential. Qar'thin settled into his gravity-adjusted seat, his tentacles curling with interest. The gravity wave paradox holo-projection floated in the center of the room, a 1,000-year-old problem that had reduced even the most brilliant minds to quantum particles of doubt. The paradox itself was beautiful in its complexity, a mathematical representation of how gravity waves behaved in the presence of dark matter, but with variables that seemed to contradict the very laws of the universe themselves. Perhaps Qar'thin spoke, causing the room to fall silent. "We are being too hasty in our judgment. After all, it was a species from a high-gravity world that first helped us understand quantum tunneling." "That was different," Professor Melrin's field crackled. "The Jovians at least understood the basic principles of 11-dimensional mathematics. These humans still think 3-dimensionally." The dean's crystalline form shimmered with what could only be described as a sigh. "The decision has already been made. The human student Sarah Chen will arrive at the start of the next academic cycle. We will of course implement all necessary safety protocols." Qar'thin found his optical appendages drawn back to the gravity wave paradox projection. For a millennium, it had defied solution. The greatest minds in the galaxy had approached it with everything from quantum computing to psychic mathematics. None had succeeded. The idea that a species that had barely mastered interstellar travel, could contribute anything meaningful to its solution seemed absurd. But then again, thought Qar'thin, his whistling tubes vibrating softly, the most profound discoveries often came from the most unexpected places. The day Sarah Chen arrived at the Galactic Institute, 3 different environmental alarm systems activated simultaneously. She had merely stepped out of her transport pod, yet her 37-degree body temperature registered as a potential fusion reactor breach, her bone density scared the structural integrity sensors, and her bacterial biome triggered the contamination protocols. "Please remain still," Deathworlder Chen announced the automated system, while a shimming containment field snapped into place. Sarah just smiled. She'd been warned about this. Her short black hair floated slightly in the static field as she stood there, datapad in hand, looking far too calm for someone who could theoretically punch through the reinforced walls. Professor Qar'thin observed from a safe distance, all 7 of his eyes focusing and refocusing. The human was smaller than expected. The protective exosuit they'd prepared rated to contain a small supernova sat unused as she proved she could maintain safe distances without it. Your atmospheric requirements have been adjusted in your designated areas, Dean Voxtel's crystalline form sparkled professionally. Though I must ask, are you certain you don't need a gravity compensator? Sarah laughed, a sound that made several plasma-based students quickly retreat into their containment spheres. No thank you. 1.2 times Earth gravity? That's like wearing a light backpack. From the gathered crowd, student Kip Lore's gravitational sensors quivered. But your muscle density readings. You could lift a small transport vehicle. Only if I really needed to, Sarah replied with another one of those dangerous-looking smiles. Several more students backed away. Professor Melren's probability field fluctuated wildly as she whispered to Qar'thin, "Did you see that? The human used its teeth as a threat display. We should increase security measures." "Those are called smiles," Qar'thin corrected, his tentacles waving dismissively. "I've studied Earth cultural documents. It's apparently meant to be reassuring, though." He had to admit, the sight of all those calcium-based protrusions was somewhat unsettling. Sarah Chen took her first steps into the quantum mathematics wing, and the entire hallway of students parted like a cosmic wave avoiding a black hole. Her footsteps, each one carrying enough force to crack the shell of a Rigelian space crab, echoed through the corridors. The only sound more prominent was the continuous beeping of various safety sensors trying to classify her as either a natural disaster or a new form of energy. "Your first class begins in 3 microcycles," Dean Voxtel informed her, crystal structure maintaining a professional opacity. "Professor Qar'thin's Advanced Universal Mathematics. I trust you're prepared." Sarah nodded, clutching her archaic paper notebook, a sight that caused several academic monitoring systems to glitch in confusion. "Been looking forward to it, especially after hearing about the famous gravity wave paradox." At the mention of the paradox, Professor Qar'thin's whistling tubes let out an inadvertent trill. Surely she wasn't suggesting, no, impossible. Not even the quantum computers of the Andromeda Alliance had managed a viable solution. Still, something in the casual way she'd mentioned it sent a shiver through all 4 of his spinal columns. The Advanced Universal Mathematics classroom hummed with the soft vibrations of 30 different species' thought processes. Professor Qar'thin's tentacles danced across the quantum display, projecting the infamous gravity wave paradox in all its 11-dimensional glory. The holographic equations twisted through the air like strands of mathematical DNA, each variable glowing with the accumulated frustration of 1,000 years of failed solutions. As is tradition, Professor Qar'thin announced, his whistling tubes modulating for maximum dramatic effect, "We begin each new term by allowing students to attempt the gravity wave paradox. A problem that has." He paused, noting Sarah Chen scribbling furiously in her paper notebook, humbled the greatest minds in our galaxy. Student Kip Lore's gravitational sensors swelled with pride. "Professor, I've studied the historical attempts. The Arcturus Collective spent 3 centuries trying to solve it with their quantum hive mind." Indeed, Qar'thin's optical appendages swiveled appreciatively, and the silicon consciousness of Vega dedicated 50,000 parallel processing cores for a millennium, only to conclude the problem was, quote, "annoyingly organic in nature." The class rippled with appreciative mathematical humor. All except Sarah, who was now drawing what appeared to be crude circles in her notebook. Qar'thin felt his primary heart skip a beat. Was she doodling during the presentation of the galaxy's most notorious mathematical challenge? "The paradox," he continued, trying to ignore the scratch of her primitive writing tool, "appears deceptively simple. We can observe gravity waves behaving anomalously around dark matter, yet every equation we construct suggests such behavior should be impossible. The mathematics simply refuse to align." A Jovian student floated forward in their pressure sphere. "But Professor, couldn't we simply apply the Hawking-Zetal uncertainty principle to the 3rd quantum variable?" Qar'thin's tentacles rippled with pleasure. "A common first attempt. However, when we carry that solution to its logical conclusion," his appendages manipulated the hologram, and the equations twisted themselves into an impossible knot before exploding into mathematical gibberish. Several students recoiled. A crystalline being in the back row actually cracked from the sheer logic of it. "The paradox," Qar'thin continued, "seems to suggest that either our understanding of gravity is fundamentally flawed," or he stopped mid-sentence. Sarah Chen had raised her hand. Not her probability field, not her quantum marker, not even a psychic tendril. Just her actual physical hand. The classroom fell so silent you could hear a photon drop. "Yes," Deathworlder Chen Qar'thin managed, his whistling tubes constricting nervously. What if Sarah said, standing up with her notebook, we're thinking about this backwards? Instead of trying to solve why gravity waves behave weird around dark matter, what if we consider why dark matter behaves weird around gravity waves? The silence deepened. Somewhere, a quantum uncertainty resolved itself just to get away from the absurdity of the suggestion. That's Professor Qar'thin's optical appendages all blinked simultaneously. That's not how we approach theoretical physics in advanced mathematics. The standard procedure is to first establish a 12-dimensional framework, then work backward through the quantum probability fields. Right, Sarah interrupted, walking toward the hologram. Several students instinctively engaged their personal force fields. But look at this part here, she pointed at a cluster of equations with her pencil. These variables? They remind me of something we studied in basic Earth physics, about how waves behave in water. Professor Qar'thin, who had been observing from the doorway, let out an audible gasp. She's comparing the fundamental forces of the universe to liquid dynamics on a planetary surface. Just. Hear me out, Sarah continued, apparently oblivious to the academic scandal she was causing. She reached for the holographic controls, then stopped. How do I? Qar'thin, moving purely on academic autopilot now, extended a tentacle and authorized her access. The human's fingers, each strong enough to crush a standard datapad, began manipulating the 1,000-year-old equations with the casualness of someone rearranging furniture. See, if we flip our perspective and treat dark matter as the medium rather than the anomaly, her hands moved faster, rearranging variables like pieces of a puzzle. The hologram twisted, fought against the changes, and then started to stabilize into something new. Professor Qar'thin's whistling tubes went completely dry. In his 4 centuries of teaching, he had never seen anything quite like this. It was elegant. It was bizarre. It was impossible, he whispered. But his tentacles were already racing to keep up with the implications. Sarah stood before the hovering equations, wielding her pencil like a conductor's baton. The entire class watched in horrified fascination as she continued to dismantle a millennium of established mathematical principles with the casual ease of someone solving a daily crossword puzzle. Okay, so here's the thing, she said, circling a cluster of quantum variables with her finger. We've been treating dark matter like it's this mysterious force that breaks all the rules, right? But back on Earth, we had this similar problem with water waves. Professor Qar'thin's tentacles coiled in academic distress. Deathworlder Chen, you cannot possibly be suggesting that a planetary liquid dynamics problem could relate to universal cosmic forces. But that's exactly it. Sarah's eyes lit up with excitement, causing several nearby students to activate their emergency shields. Look, hundreds of years ago on Earth, we had this thing called the wave-particle duality paradox. Light behaved like both a wave and a particle, which seemed impossible until we changed how we thought about it. She grabbed her notebook, flipping to a page covered in what looked like primitive drawings of ripples. When we drop a stone in water, it creates waves, right? But the water itself isn't moving forward, it's just moving up and down. The energy transfers through the medium, but the medium stays relatively in place. The class stared blankly. Student Kipler's gravitational sensors had completely shut down in confusion. Now watch this. Sarah turned back to the hologram, her fingers dancing through the equations. If we stop thinking of dark matter as the thing being affected by gravity waves, and instead think of it as the medium the waves are traveling through. She made a few more adjustments, and suddenly the mathematical representation shifted. The equations, which had been fighting each other for 1,000 years, began to align like iron filings around a magnet. Holy quantum fluctuations, whispered Professor Qar'thin from the doorway, her probability field nearly collapsing. See, Sarah continued, now fully immersed in her explanation. The reason the math never worked before is because we were trying to solve for the wrong thing. It's not that gravity waves behave weirdly around dark matter, it's that dark matter is the cosmic ocean that gravity waves travel through. She scribbled a quick diagram in her notebook and held it up. Just like how ocean waves don't move the water forward, gravity waves don't move dark matter, they oscillate through it. The apparent anomalies we've been observing are actually just interference patterns, like when 2 waves meet in a pond. Professor Qar'thin's 7 eyes were rapidly shifting focus between the original paradox and Sarah's modified equations. His whistling tubes produced a sound that hadn't been heard in the academy for centuries, the tone of pure mathematical astonishment. But this would mean his tentacles trembled as they traced the implications. This would suggest that dark matter isn't just present in space, it's the fundamental medium of space itself. Exactly, Sarah beamed, causing a minor panic among the more light-sensitive students. And look what happens when we apply this principle to the original equations. Her hands flew across the holographic interface, and the mathematical representation transformed. The previously contradictory variables aligned themselves into a pattern so beautiful that three crystalline students began to resonate in harmony. If we treat dark matter as the medium, she explained, drawing more diagrams, then these quantum variables aren't showing errors at all, they're showing the propagation patterns of gravity waves through the dark matter medium. It's exactly like mapping ocean wave patterns, just in 11 dimensions instead of 2. A Jovian student's pressure sphere briefly malfunctioned from the shock, but that would mean all of our previous assumptions about gravity wave propagation were based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Professor Qar'thin finished, his voice barely a whisper. We've been trying to solve a quantum mechanics problem with advanced mathematics when what we really needed was basic wave physics. Sarah completed his sentence, drawing one final diagram. The kind of stuff humans figured out watching waves on a beach. The classroom erupted into chaos. Student Kiplor's gravitational sensors overloaded completely. 3 quantum probability students had to be escorted out to recalibrate their reality matrices. Professor Mel Rinsfield had turned a shade of probability that shouldn't have been possible in this dimension. Professor Qar'thin slowly extended a trembling tentacle toward the final equation. It was elegant, it was simple, it was primitive. And it perfectly explained every observation of gravity wave behavior that had been recorded in the last 1,000 years. The solution, he said, his whistling tubes barely functioning, was to think less advanced. Sarah shrugged, a gesture that made several nearby force fields flicker nervously. Sometimes the simplest answer is the right one. We have a saying on Earth: when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. She paused, looking around at her alien classmates. Though I guess that reference doesn't really translate here. The holographic display continued to rotate, showing the perfect harmony of her solution from all 11 dimensions. It was undeniable. The gravity wave paradox, the most challenging mathematical problem in the galaxy, had just been solved using principles that predated human space travel. Professor Qar'thin looked at Sarah's paper notebook, then at his quantum computational array, then back at the notebook. Would anyone, he said faintly, like to explain to the dean why our most sophisticated mathematical problem was solved using graphite marks on processed tree pulp? No one volunteered. They were too busy watching the hologram spin, showing the elegant dance of gravity waves through the cosmic ocean of dark matter, all explained by the kind of physics humans had discovered by skipping stones across ponds. In the stunned silence, Sarah quietly returned to her seat, carefully tucking her world-changing notebook into her bag, while the advanced mathematics classroom around her tried to process how a species that still used combustion engines had just revolutionized their understanding of the universe.